Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the American musician Peter Holsapple, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Was in a lot of bands, including the dB's, and also has worked and played with people such as R.E.M, Hootie and the Blowfish, and also the Continental Drifters, and various other bits and pieces that you'll find out about in this fascinating interview. So after 7 minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Peter, it's over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was 8 years old, the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, and I had a brother who was 11 years older than me that leaned into me one day and said, you should watch this program and see this band. I think you're going to like that. So that was the first awakening. But, we also, as kids in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, of which Chris and Mitch Easter and a bunch of people were, I was a kid that was able to get radio signal from Chicago on Sunday nights, a station WCFL, and they had a DJ named Ron Britton, and he had a show called The Subterranean Circus. And it would always start with the American Metaphysical Circus by the United States of America, which is a very, very obscure band on Columbia Records. But that was the kind of place where you would hear stuff that wasn't on AM radio. AM radio growing up in North Carolina was pretty great because it was Beatles and it was Stones and it was Paul Revere and the Raiders and it was James Brown and it was Buck Owens, and it was a wide swath of popular music. It wasn't as pigeonholed as things are at this point. The idea of formats it was a lot. It was stricter in a way, but it was also pretty open. But
yes.
Then when everything went over from AM to FM radio over here, that's when sort of underground music kind of took over. And, so when I was like 12 years old, I spent my first money on a copy of Bare Wires by John Mayall and his Blues Breakers because I'd heard something on Ron Britton, I'm sure. And so I got introduced to Mick Taylor and Dick Hextall Smith and people like that really meant a lot to me over the years, So that was it. We had to do a lot of our own digging.
Yes. Well, digging was always exciting in our younger days,
Wasn't it, though? You had to really look for things. You didn't. These days, it's marvelous that everything is so accessible via YouTube or streaming services. But I think the thrill of the chase is missing now.
Yes. Well, yes.
Along with liner notes.
Well, it was kind of interesting because my brother, I had an older brother, 7 years older than me, and he was into that prog rock world of yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay James Harvest, even the solo work of Rick Wakeman. And I was quite young, so I'd sneak into his room and listen to these records and be kind of mesmerized. But he had one of those like books on classic rock albums, and you sort of look through them, and there was, in those days, I suppose this was the 70s time or 80s, it was like there would be Van Morrison's Astral Weeks and Moondance, a few Joni Mitchell, or Pet Shop Boys, the Beatles, Velvet Underground, and things like that. But you couldn't just go and listen to them. You had to go to the library or go to the charity shops and find these records, and had no idea when you put on the Velvet Underground album what you were going to experience. And it was nothing because it like you expected, because it was Sunday morning, then followed by all this other stuff, and you felt like strangely confused, but and slightly slightly sort of mesmerized by it and violated by it. But that was not what I'm listening to in the charts. And the same with the Incredible String Band would sort of be in there, and you think, perhaps I should get into them again. And Captain Beefheart, obviously, they'd always have that in there. And again, you think, oh my goodness me, what was that?
Well,
but yes,
we had a record store that I ended up working at across the highway from where I grew up, and we had the older guys working in there, right? I was 11, 12, 13 going in there. And these are guys that were like 16, 17, 18, 20 years old. And so I remember walking into the listening booth, and then we also had a listening booth in there. So you had the
Yes.
turntable, and you could actually go in there and listen to
And
the
the
open copies.
smoke.
So I walked in to the listening booth with a copy of Sweet Baby James under my arm, and one of the older guys said, "Wait, don't listen to that. Listen to this." And he handed me a copy of "Lick My Decals Off, Baby" by Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band, and I was like, "Okay, there's something more out there." I mean, it was great. I felt like, I mean, another thing that I read a lot was the Schwann catalog, and that was a small it was a monthly catalog that would come out, and it basically had all of the records that were in print. And so I would see all these things in there, and I would be like, I think I need to hear these. I don't even know what they are, But that was my ammunition. And so I would like go to the record store and order these things. And sometimes they could order them, but more often than not, they didn't. Finally, we
Yes.
got a like the hippie record store. And just to give you some idea what that was like, it was a lot of Beatle bootlegs, and Stones bootlegs and stuff like that, and blacklight posters. But the owner was able to order for me Henry the Human Fly by Richard Thompson, his first solo record, and actually got it within about a week of it being released. And so I think I was probably one of the first people in America to actually own a copy of that. And of course, loved Richard, loved Fairport Convention from the instant I heard them,
Yes. Well,
So
absolutely.
just tried to stay open-minded. I still try to stay open-minded. And, I've got 3 kids that are pretty open-minded listeners. I've got
Well,
a son that I
absolutely.
just handed a copy of the first Moby Grape record to this weekend when he came home for his sister's graduation. And, my 18-year-old is listening to Joni Mitchell as we're talking, I mean, she loves Billie Eilish, and she loves, current favorites as well, but she has an appreciation for the finer music that her dad has really struggled to get across to her that is important and formative.
The
So,
interesting thing is, though, you obviously there at the birth of kind of popular music, thinking of the Beatles as a sort of ground zero and not people like Elvis and Little Richard. But you were there, weren't you? Whereas that generation has so much to, I don't know what they do going back, because I didn't have too much time to catch up on what I'd missed. It was a bit, and then there was layers down. But you didn't have to struggle. Well, you struggled a bit, but not like now. I don't know how kids would sort of go back if you got that curiosity and fascination with the history of pop music.
well, yeah, I mean, my brother, the aforementioned older brother, before he went to college, handed over his stereo, and he gave me his copies of Projections by the Blues Project and the first Left Bank album and Smiley Smile, Wild Honey, and Friends by the Beach Boys. And I was just absolutely captivated by all of those. And then he also gave me those Blues Rags and Hollers records by Kerner Ray and Glover, which were acoustic blues records that, 3 of Bob Dylan's contemporaries from Minneapolis, but they were in there, they were doing some of their own songs, but they were doing Lead Belly, and they were doing Sun House and stuff like that. And it was just, as so many people did when we heard Cream, when we heard them playing Crossroads, then we went back to King of the Delta Blues because we didn't know any better. That was our introduction at that age. So we did try to work backward. I don't know how kids do it these days. I think, having places like Bandcamp and things like that have got a lot of catalog, and they've got people that are kind of curating that. I think that they try to make a point of sending people backward as well as forward. Forward is very important because you can't sit still. You can't assume, I mean, there's a lot of people my age that just, they grouse about, I make good records since whatever, and I'm like, dude, have you heard the Beths? I mean, that's lazy listening. If you can't find good new stuff, then you're not looking very hard.
No, I agree. I find it a bit embarrassing, just wishing that when people say that, they kind of took ownership of, you know, themselves, their own mental or emotional state of mind, because it's like, well, if you're into music, you would be discovering things. You're obviously not that bothered. Even that create quite a sort of bit of conflict probably. But I do think, I remember people saying, oh, there was no good music after 83, and going, because that obviously that 83 onwards was kind of this period in my life, I suppose. And I think, oh, so what, The Cure, The Smiths, Prince, Madonna, I mean, it's like, so you just stopped, it was like, yeah, when the Clash, Police cut the crap, that was the kind of end of popular music. I think a bit of a sweeping statement. You just think you don't want to be too old, too young, do you? Because that's not a good thing, really. And R.E.M.
People, and I have to say also, there are a fair amount of musicians out there that kind of stopped listening to other people's records when they started making their own. And I think that that's incredibly lazy also. That's why I appreciate somebody like Jackson Browne, who I've gotten to work with a couple of times with my band, the Continental Drifters. He is spot on. He listens to stuff. He's aware of stuff. We got to back him up playing Waterloo Sunset one time. It's just the songs he wouldn't expect maybe Jackson Browne to know. But and then there's this whole move of a documentary for anybody who's ever lived, pretty much. I mean, there's the Sly Stone documentary that I haven't seen yet, Sly Lives, that Questlove did. And then there's that beautiful Lost Angel, The Genius of Judy Sill, which is a brilliant, brilliant documentary on somebody that gets incredibly short shrift, but people are seeing that now, and they are looking for Judy Sill and Heart Food, and so that's good. It's doing what it's supposed to do. I mean, Daniel Johnson. There's so many different. I mean, I figure if you live long enough and make enough records, somebody's going to do a documentary on you at some point.
Yes, it does make me laugh how many. I love them because, I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, but I'm just amazed. There was a band called R.E.M in the UK who only lasted 8 months in 1979 and released one EP, and they managed to get a documentary. There was mainly because the 4 or 5 members of the band all went on to do interesting things, and yeah. I think that was the first release on 4AD Records in the UK was the R.E.M record, and incredibly they got a documentary and made a very nice film of it, and it's fascinating. But yes, there are a lot of documentaries and books. People are all writing their memoirs, but again, yes. I do enjoy them, and it does make me laugh at the same time. So just going back to, so you had an older brother who obviously was a great beacon in your life of directing you into various musical directions. So what was your sort of first single, then the first concert you went to during that period of the 60s?
Well, my parents got some singles for me before we moved to North Carolina in 1962. I grew up originally in Connecticut, and so we had TV shows, and I liked the songs that I heard on them. And so the first single I got was a song called Afrikaan Beat by Bert Kaempfert and his orchestra, which great song. The flip side was really great. Echo in the Night. And then, I like every other kid, I guess I got a copy of Alley Cat by Bent Fabric at his piano. My first Atco record. So that was really great. And then I Beatles came along, wanted those records, I got those. When I first started buying my own records, it was a little further on. And I think the first single that I bought with my own money was Heroes and Villains by the Beach Boys.
Right.
And because I loved Good Vibrations, but I didn't really I heard it so much. And then I didn't hear Heroes and Villains very much. So I thought I better get this record. And boy, I'm glad I did. Just a beautiful, beautiful record. And, I got Sound Asleep by the Turtles, which I really liked. And I just started buying stuff, and I, put aside my allowance and buy everything I could, and then started getting magazines. started getting, well, I guess I got Rolling Stone first, but then I ended up, getting Cream magazine. And there was a wonderful magazine that was sort of the house organ at United Artist Records called Phonograph Record Magazine. And there was always a lot of interesting stuff in there. Howard Kalin and Mark Volman had a column called Blind Date with Flo and Eddie, and to which they're inevitably, if they didn't know what a record was, they would suggest that it was probably by Philip Goodhand Tate. And so I was like, okay, so maybe I should figure out what Philip Goodhand Tate sounds like. So I did, and that was kind of an ideal thing too, to have Phonograph Record Magazine, because at that point, all of the great bands that Andrew Lauder was signing, like Can and Dr. Feelgood and Man and Help Yourself and Family and well, we already knew about The Move, but Wizard and ELO, just the Groundhogs. It was amazing. What an abundance of great stuff. I'm reading Andrew's book right now, by the way, so that's well on my mind. But again, these were not things that were regularly stocked in the record store that I worked in. These were things that you really still had to hunt down, and worth every penny of what you got. And in those days also, Warner Brothers put out these 2 record sets, what were called Loss Leaders. And they were collections of the artists that were on Warner Brothers and Reprise Records. And they would throw some interesting little things in there, like the Ice Capades music by Van Dyke Parks, or a commercial that he'd written stuff for. And you'd find like an obscure Kinks B-side, when I turn off the living room light, something like that. And those were great. For $2, getting 2 LPs of stuff, what's not to love?
Well, yes, absolutely.
And then A&M Records did a record called Friends, and that was a free one. And that was superb because it had this a short version of an edited version of Hello Susie by The Move, again, which we already knew. We knew, my high school band did half of Shazam. And this is in an environment of people that really wanted to hear the Allman Brothers and Marshall Tucker Band and Leonard Skinner and James Taylor and, kind of Southern rock. So Friends had that, and it had Bloodwind Pig. It had Free. It had Quincy Jones was on there. It was also very good. But it also had Fairport Convention and Fotheringay. And that began it had Walk a While from Full House. And I was like this switch flipped. And I was like, I must hear more of this. And so I sort of was introduced to the Fairport post Sandy and Ian and loved it, just adored it. And my high school punk band even did part of the Dirty Linen medley. And that was also very cool. So we had a lot of fun, listening to all that. And I had a bunch of friends that loved the same sort of stuff. You were talking earlier about glam. I mean, I was sort of the first guy that I knew to get the first Roxy Music record. And I fell in love with that, and we got the first Brian Ferry record. And we listened to Slade. We played Slade records. We played The Sweet. The Sweet. Little Willie was a big hit over here.
Oh yes, that's a classic. I know. Well, Ballroom Blitz.
The Desolation Boulevard, a brilliant record, start to finish. We didn't hear a lot of that, so we didn't get to hear Ballroom Blitz on the radio. But we knew it because, again, it was another one of those things that we searched out.
Yes.
So the thrill of the chase.
Did you get, you mentioned Fairport. Did you go for Matthews' Southern Comfort by any chance? Ian Matthews kind of.
We didn't get that, but we did get Tigers Will Survive, Ian's second solo record. It's Ian's birthday today, by the way, 79 years old.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It is.
And I have to say, I'm very proud to say that Ian is a friend of mine. We've done shows together. We met him through Edgar Heckman at Blue Rose Records in Germany for whom the Continental Drifters and Ian recorded. And somehow or other, we all met up at South by Southwest many years ago in Austin, and we backed him up for a bunch of the songs off of excerpts from Swine Lake. And it was a fast friendship, and we were just so glad it was just neat to meet somebody like that you'd admired for a million years and find out that they're just a regular guy,
Yes, well, absolutely. I did a lovely interview with him when he'd got his book out recently. He's got his book as well, which is quite amazing. An incredible life story as well. So that's quite amazing. So what was your first concert you went to?
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. First concert I went to, you're going to have a big laugh at this, was Iron Butterfly.
Excellent.
I want to say 1969 at Wake Chapel in Winston-Salem on the campus of Wake Forest University. And it was like right after In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida had come out. And we were just like, we got to go to this because it's going to be great. And it was great, And then we started seeing other concerts. Most of the concerts came to Greensboro, which is about 30 miles east of Winston-Salem. And they had a Coliseum there, and they would get a lot of acts there. And Winston didn't get as many. I think the biggest problem with Winston-Salem was there was a night that they had opened the new Stroh's Brewery in Winston-Salem. And they had a free concert at Grove Stadium. And this is really kind of an amazing lineup. It was the Earl Scruggs Review from Flatt and Scruggs, the Dave Brubeck Quartet, plus Jerry Mulligan.
Fantastic.
So it was a quintet. The Dizzy Gillespie Orchestra and B.B. King. And it was free. It was free. But right down the street, Blood, Sweat, and Tears was playing at the Winston-Salem Coliseum. And at another venue, James Brown and his Famous Flames were playing. And that nobody showed up at the pay gigs. So that effectively killed off a lot of the concert going in Winston-Salem. But like I say, right down the road, Greensboro.
Yes.
And then you'll appreciate this. So just went to my daughter's high school graduation, which was held at Cameron Indoor Stadium on the campus of Duke University here in Durham, North Carolina, where we live. And all I could do while I was sitting there hearing the names being called and watching them all come up and get their diplomas was thinking, this is the exact room where in 1973, I saw Yes open for 10 years after. And Yes was the first tour with Rick Wakeman, and they were touring behind Fragile. And we already loved them. We loved them from Time and a Word on, just because it was like almost unplayable music. It was so good and so hard. It was very difficult stuff, and we appreciated that. But
Yes.
Mitch Easter and his girlfriend and I and a classmate of his girlfriend all went to Cameron and watched the show. And poor old 10 years after didn't stand a chance.
No. God, that would have been John Anderson. And was it Chris Squire on drums? And
Chris Squire on bass. On drums.
Oh, right.
And it was great because, like I say, Wakeman was just in the band, and so they had a grand piano, they had a Fender Rhodes electric piano, they had a mini Moog, they had a Mellotron, which I'm sure was a disaster to have to drag that thing around, and one other piece of gear. Oh, a Hammond organ. So,
blimey, that was that was quite ambitious.
It was like the basics for Rick, I think.
Yes,
so,
God,
it was a miraculous show.
Well, yes, that was when they were obviously still, I'd imagine they were still getting on, and the honeymoon period, which is all very good, because he'd had his period with the Straubs, hadn't he, just before that, and yes, and his little moment with David Bowie. So, good old Rick. I think he lives just down the road from us in Norwich towards a place called Dis. So he occasionally does little concerts in churches now. But in his glory days, like I said, the solo work of Rick with King Arthur and the Journey to the Centre of the Earth and those albums were just brilliant.
Seven Wives.
Yes, the Wives. Yeah, that was They were the
his
classic.
podcast is also hilarious. I don't know if you've watched that very much, but there are some incredible episodes. He talks to like Andy Fairweather Lowe and Roger Chapman, and it's just like these raconteurs. They're really great. I love it.
Yes, he did a really good one on the, I don't know, something called Back of the Van. You know, when bands are starting out and you all have to get in a little transit van traveling around the countryside. He did a nice little bit about people's memories of those early years of being squashed in the back there with your amps and guitars and dealing with that life for a few years or months before you either go to the next level up or you just quit the band, you know. But yes, it's interesting. So when you were born 1954, weren't you? So 16.
56.
So was it 56? So yes, that's right. So what was it like? What was it like when the 70s trundled round and you went, oh, this is all going so well. Oh, now we've got the death of Brian Jones, and then there's Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison dying, Altamont, you know, Manson, you know, various assassinations. So the 60s, you know, started well, went really well, then ended on a down. And what was it like for you at that age of 14 as you were like started to think, this is amazing? Oh dear, that's not good.
Well, I mean, I was getting ready to be shipped off to prep school in New Hampshire.
I thought you were going to say Vietnam.
At 14 years old. It was a family tradition. Everybody went to prep school. And I didn't fare very well. But I remember right before I left, Al Wilson from Canned Heat died of an overdose. I really loved Canned Heat a lot. I just thought that they were a great sounding band. And I thought he was the kind of the cool guy in the band. He was a blues scholar and, you know, he played slide guitar and he had that beautiful high kind of Skip James voice. And so that really affected me. And then went off to school that year. And that was when Hendrix and Janis died. But I was also going through a moment where I was shifting into a very deep fascination, which I still have, with the great bands out of Detroit and Ann Arbor, like the Bob Seger System and the Stooges, and most of all the MC5. And down the hallway from me in my dormitory were two seniors. I was a freshman, 14, and they were 17-year-old seniors. And one was William Magoon from Ann Arbor, and he came down and he had all his. Back in those days, Cream was printed on newspaper, and rather not a magazine, but it was like a newspaper. And so he had all his copies of that. And then his dear friend, who was next door to him, was a guy named Ben Tench from Gainesville, Florida. And Ben was a piano player and had been playing in bands at prep school. And then here comes this kid with a Fender amplifier and a Les Paul Special up from North Carolina on the hall, considerably younger, but ready to rock. And so we started a band and we started playing, and we had a little record store in Exeter, New Hampshire, and we were able to get things like the first Mott the Hoople record that came out around that time, and we just fell in love with that. And we fell in love with the Flamin' Groovies, and we had all sorts of stuff. We were doing Dirt by the Stooges, you know. And this is, you know, again, we're in this environment of smart kids that made their way to New Hampshire for their high schooling. And it was marvelous. And we had people that really liked us. And so that was great. And we got a chance to play for people, and they dug it. And I didn't really survive there very well. I flunked my first courses in my entire life. And I left with my tail between my legs and went back to North Carolina. But somehow or other, I had achieved a kind of semi-mythical status of, oh, he came back and he's playing really good. And so I joined a band with Mitch Easter and Chris Stamey called Rittenhouse Square. And then we went and cut a record in Greensboro, 6 songs over Easter weekend one year, and put it out ourselves. It was $500, 500 copies of it. The drummer paid for it, and he didn't bother to get covers. He just got paper sleeves. Oh, well. Now, this is a record that is actually kind of hilarious. You can find it on YouTube. And if you look at the Discogs listing and see what the price that it goes for these days, it's just obscene. It's like, I like to refer to it as a collector's item by people who've never heard it. But it's, it's
What
really
was your band called? What was the band called?
Rittenhouse Square.
Right.
For some reason or other, named after the district in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which we had nothing to do with. But it was the third incarnation of that band. The first was a kind of a cover band. Second was a really massive group with Mitch and the drummer and all the local superstars. And I remember standing in the orchestra pit at our high school for the auditorium and watching them playing note for note version of Yours Is No Disgrace by Yes. And just my jaw was on the ground and I was like, I could do this. I really should do this, shouldn't I? Yes, I need to do this. And it was so great. And that was before I went to Exeter.
Yes.
But when I came back, it was like, okay, so we started the third version of Rittenhouse, and that went okay for a while. And then the drummer, Mitch and Chris and Bobby, the drummer, went up to New York and tried to shop the record. And so they went to like Roulette Records and must have talked to somebody there. And, nobody was really interested. And I had to leave the band because I was too young to go spend the summer in New York. Understood. So I started hanging out with Will Rigby, who ended up being the drummer for the dB's, and our friend Bob Northcott, who was kind of the, I don't know what you'd say, kind of our guru for all things cool. He was the guy that kind of turned us on to Lenny Bruce, and he knew all the Velvet Underground stuff inside and out, and he had a singing voice that was somewhere between Iggy Pop and Barbra Streisand.
Nice.
And so we had a band called Little Diesel, and we were sort of the first punk band, the first like post Nuggets band in our area. And so we were doing I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night, and we were doing Pictures of Matchstick Men. And it was great stuff. And we started writing songs, and we even cut a record. We cut a 14 or 15 song record in Chris Stamey's bedroom. Chris had one of those TAC 2340 7-inch reel-to-reel 4-tracks. And so we cut it in his bedroom, and he had the little tiny Fender Champ amplifiers, the little tweed ones. He had a few of those things, and they were kind of stuck up on his wall. And so you had the 5 of us in there, plus Chris, plus our friend Chris Chamas, in this small bedroom, all wailing away, and cut this record. And it eventually came out. We put it out, but it came out on an 8-track cartridge. And I think we had 25 copies of that made.
Blimey. I was just looking at your Rittenhouse Square. That goes for eight, doesn't it? £888 on Discogs.
It's ridiculous.
So people keep saying, "Oh, I wish you'd reissue it." Oh, why don't you? I would love to get a copy.
I think the two people that really stand in the way of that are Mitch and myself. I think we both feel like it's cute, I mean, it's like teenagers making a record, and I mean, like with no direction, with no producer. Where's Larry Page when you need him? But we wanted to get into a studio and do something. And so we did, but it didn't mean that it was necessarily great stuff. I mean, that band was great in the sense that that was the band that played Cherry Blossom Clinic Revisited note for note. We played Teenage Head by the Flaming Groovies when it was a brand new song. We played Rock and Roll Queen by Mott the Hoople. We played, I think 3 of the first 4 songs that we worked up were from the first Wishbone Ash record, because it had dueling lead guitars, and we loved that.
Yes.
But it wasn't like it was a hotbed of Wishbone Ash fans in Winston-Salem. We just played what we liked. And the other thing was, not to pat ourselves on the back, but I think we thought, like, if we didn't play it, where was anybody going to hear it? They weren't going to hear it on the radio. At that point, we're talking 1972, things are getting kind of soft rock, what everybody likes to refer to these days as yacht rock.
Yacht rock, I know, this new term.
Yeah, I mean, there's bands that's their stock and trade, and I get it, but I don't like those songs any more than I did then. I don't want to go see people sing "Smoke from a Distant Fire" or "Sailing" by Christopher Cross. Got no interest. Although I was fascinated to discover that Christopher Cross, who was actually quite a good guitar player, subbed for Ritchie Blackmore at a Deep Purple show and pulled it off like an ace. There's YouTube recordings of that, and not the guy you would expect to be sitting in for Ritchie Blackmore.
No, my God, that's. I'll have to check that out. I know
Yeah, don't waste a
Gillen.
lot of time on it, but just, I mean,
It's well, I had a soft spot for early Deep Purple. I was always amazed that Ian Gillan was in Jesus Christ Superstar, and then you think, yeah, that vocal would have gone so well, wouldn't it? I can't remember what character he played, but you could imagine. I think he's on the original soundtrack.
well, he's on the original version, the original recording of it, which also features one of my very favorite groups, the Grease Band, as the main backing band, Henry McCullough and Alan Spencer and all those guys. But I mean, Victor Brox is on there. I can't even remember who all sang all over that, but it's a beautiful. I mean, it's great. It's maybe the best version of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes, there's a lot of good power chords, I have to say, but I'm quite enjoying watching Ritchie Blackmore and his partner now with their little sort of pokey hats and their little salutes and doing Christmas records, and they're obviously having a nice time, and God bless them.
Too.
I just think it's kind of amazing, this dark overlord of heavy metal. But then I heard him talking about getting inspiration. He said a lot of the riffs he got from sort of listening to obscure Bulgarian folk music, played on acoustic instruments, and then would just kind of ramp it up on the electric guitar and said, "Hey, presto!" No one will ever know where I slightly got that one from, but no one will ever.
And you really can't beat the solo on Black Knight. I mean, that is just like that. Talk about using a vibrato bar on a guitar as a lethal weapon. That is absolutely a perfect example of that. I love that single.
Yes, well, God, I know. Yes, Burn and Fireball were my favourite, Deep Purple tracks, which and then the ballad, When a Blind Man Cries. As a young person hearing that, I think, oh, this is so profound. I'm not sure why, but it is. But
we love, I mean, those the earliest of the Deep Purple records when Rod Evans and Nick Simper were in the band before Glover and Ian Gillan. Those were hits in America, versions of Kentucky Woman and Hush, the Joe South song. Those were, I mean, it was all that wonderful distorted John Lord Hammond. When we finally discovered that Lord used Marshalls for his amplification, besides I mean, most people with a Hammond organ matched it up with a Leslie rotating speaker, and he probably had that too. But that grit was coming from the Marshalls that he had. I know it was so great. We loved that.
Yes, it was interesting. I did an interview with the producer who was on Fireball, and I asked him about that sound at the start with or some sort of, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was the air conditioning being switched on, and I recorded it and then added that to the start of the record." I thought, "Oh my God, that was such a kind of moment in my teenage years. Listen to this record in my brother's bedroom, and there you go. He explains how what that sound comes from is just the air conditioning being switched on and hearing this incredible sound, and just thought that will work. It sounds a bit like I don't know, it's just this incredible explosion at the start of Fireball, but I'll have to listen back to it. It's good. It's all very interesting. I think that was he was one of those real junior engineers who I think got left with the task of recording, and he did it, and then that was the start of his very long, illustrious career.
Like Hurricane Smith.
Actually, they all start like Jimmy Iovine's a bit the same, isn't he? He starts with sort of sweeping the floor in the studio, and then one weekend works with John Lennon, and then that's Jimmy Iovine. So yes, you've got to start somewhere. So then, then the dB's appear, don't they? This is the next next chapter in your life. So is this the mid-70s at this stage?
Well, the dB's came about because Chris Stamey, who had a band in '76 called Sneakers, And they put out one of the first DIY, for lack of a better word, new wave records. It wasn't really punk rock, because if you listen to those songs, you can tell that the composition is such that it was obviously somebody that knew how to write music. And Chris was. Chris took composition courses at the University of North Carolina. And so he was well into his college career at that point. And so he knew what he was doing. And he had Will Rigby in the band. Mitch played with it. Our friend Don Dixon was like at the controls of the 2340 Tascam recorder. And they cut it in a house, in Chapel Hill, where Chris was going to school. And so that got some mileage, people started perking up their ears. That and, the first Parubu records on Heorthan Records. All these people, Devo, were doing independent records right around the time of, the Sex Pistols coming out, and then the Clash, and then all of the bands like that were on Sire Records, like the Ramones and the Talking Heads and the Dead Boys. And, we got the Saints from Australia. But all these people were, the feeling was no label is really going to take us seriously. So, well, we might as well put it out ourselves. So they did. So Chris got some mileage out of that. And this friend, Alan Betrock, who was the original publisher of New York Rocker magazine, said that Chris should move up to New York, and got a gig playing with a group called the Erasers, and then ended up playing bass with Alex Chilton, who, somewhere around 72 or 73, Chris had discovered When My Baby's Beside Me, which was the first single from #1 record by Big Star, because it got played on AM radio in Winston-Salem, amazingly enough. If you think back and your history, they were on Ardent Records, which was distributed by Stax at that point, Stax Fantasy. Stax had been part of Atlantic, but then it became part of Fantasy Records, the people that put out Creedence Clearwater and a lot of jazz stuff. So, but they also, somewhere around when that single came out, Fantasy and Stax dropped the ball, and Ardent had serviced the single to radio stations, which is why Chris heard it on there, but then nothing more. So we had to, that's another one of those hunting down the record. Will had to drive to Raleigh to get a copy of it, and which is like 110 miles away.
Right.
So we loved Big Star. Big Star was that, again, another switch flipped. And it was like, wow, we were already hearing stuff like the Raspberries and Badfinger. We loved Raspberries and Badfinger and Blue Ash from Ohio, and we knew about that. But Big Star really just was the complete package. We just loved it. And so when Chris got the opportunity to play with Alex up there, Alex was kind of over Big Star in a lot of ways. He was sort of in that beginnings of the Like Flies on Sherbert period, and Feudalist Tarts, and he was more into R&B, which he'd been doing. He'd been the singer for the Box Tops. I mean, you think about this. This is a kid that's 16 years old that gets yanked out of public school to sing the #1 song in the country on tour, and so when the bottom dropped out of that, and the Box Tops stopped having hits after a while. And so he went up to New York and lived in Greenwich Village and tried to do some stuff up there. And then he moved back to Memphis, and then he moved back to New York. And that's when Chris started playing with him. And then Chris, when he moved back to Memphis, Chris started a band with Gene Holder, another friend from Winston-Salem, and Will Rigby, and got them to come up. And they started doing shows as Chris Stamey and the dB's. And meanwhile, I'd moved to Memphis and was trying to do something down there, hoping a little bit of the mojo of all the Hootie stuff, the Big Star stuff kind of rubbed off, and didn't really. But I got to do some recording, and then I got a call from Will saying Chris would like you to come up and audition to play keyboards. And so I was like, It's really hot here in Memphis and really damp, and the police and the fire department went on strike, and it was, things aren't really working out for me down here. So yeah, I'll come on up. And so I did. And apparently I passed the audition. So we started playing, and then we dropped Chris Stamey and it became just the dB's.
Right. And this was in 78 you joined the band.
Yes. And then we played a gig, Halloween at Irving Plaza in New York, and we were pretty terrible. We were in the middle of the bill. We just didn't sound very good. So we went back and we rehearsed and we rehearsed and we rehearsed. And the next time we came out, we opened for a band at a club called Hurrah, and we made short work of them. We were so good. And people really liked the songs we had. Chris wrote, I wrote. I came up with a sheaf of songs, and Chris had them, and we both taught them to the band. And we came from a world of demos. We made a lot of demos. We cut a bunch of stuff, and we did get to go into the recording studio because Chris did a deal with Orc Records, which is Terry Ork and Charles Ball in New York. And they're the people that put out Little Johnny Jewel by Television. And they put out, I can't remember what all they put out, but they did a deal with Warner Brothers. Ork did a deal with Warner Brothers. And Ork UK, as we were calling it, asked us to do a couple of singles. So we basically went in and used the money to start an album. And kind of good planning. And we cut a 45 of a song called Black and White, which is a song of mine. And that got some attention. It got single of the week at NME, and it got played on New York Underground Radio. Meg Griffin played it on her show. And all of a sudden it was like people were paying attention to us, and it was really nice. And we felt like something could really happen. So then we finished up an album with those tracks called Stance for Decibels, and we couldn't get anybody to play with it in the States. Nobody was picking up on us. So Betrock was friends with Di Davies and Mark Anders at Albion Music, which is a publishing company in England, in London. So Chris and I went over and signed with them, and that was fun. And then it became evident that nobody was going to put the record out in the States. So Mark and Di were like, well, we could put it out. We put out 999 records, and we put out Hazel O'Connor with and that was when Breaking Glass was kind of taking off. And so even though her record for Albion didn't do all that, but they took the opportunity, and they were clever. They were doing things like putting out the record in a bean can. And we came over and we did this thing, a show called Taking Liberties at the Rainbow. And it was us and the Bongos and the Ray Beats and the Bush Tetters and the Flesh Tones and a group called Poly Rock. And we played there, and it was freezing cold because nobody bothered to turn on the heat. It was like in February. And we came over and we did that. And it was like, the way it was sort of perceived, I think, in the British press was like, these guys think they're hot shit. They're not really, they're all right, but we've got all these other bands like the Gang of Four and Delta 5 and the Mekons and interesting stuff like that. And, these guys are just sort of treading water of old forms of music. But we went out and toured with the Ray Beats, and, we played all over the country, and, we would play places like Sheffield and go to a party after, and a girl would come up and say, I don't know why you guys bother to play guitars. It's all going to be synthesizers from here on out. And to a degree, Human League. So maybe she was right. Depeche Mode. But, and we did a second record. We actually went over and lived in London for 6 weeks and did a second record at Ramport, which was the Who studio in Battersea. And that was great. It was called Repercussion. And our producer, Scott Litt, came over and lived with us, and we had a great old time. And then we came back and we toured again, opening for Dave Edmunds. And that was a lot of fun. Although, the only place that we got a request for an encore was in Cardiff. And we couldn't really do an encore in Cardiff because it just didn't seem like the right thing with Dave. It just felt like his his folks were there, his people were there somehow. So, but we had a great time. Great band. Garrett Watkins was in the band. John David, Mickey G on guitar. Wonderful stuff. And then we came back to the state, and again, nobody picked up on that record. And finally, we got a deal with Bearsville Records, home of Todd Rundgren and Foghat and a lot of other artists. Trying to think of who all was on there. And they were distributed by Warner Brothers. And so we thought, well, maybe this is going to be it. And then Chris left. So it went down to me as the single songwriter. And it was a great record. It was a record called Like This. And then had a song called Love is for Lovers that we felt like was going to be kind of our shoe-in. And right as the record came out, Warner Brothers dropped Bearsville. And so the record didn't have any distribution. So we went out on tour with R.E.M., our friends in R.E.M., who at that point were doing pretty well for themselves.
Oh, were they on IRS Records as well?
They were on IRS, but we were on Bearsville. And so we would be doing these in-stores for the Bearsville record, and there weren't any copies of the Bearsville record to be sold. So it was sort of like, and we're doing this, why? But, and we'd get in front of the R.E.M. audiences, and they liked us. They tolerated us, R.E.M. was really great about that. They took us out for a number of tours.
Yes.
So, and then Albert Grossman, who was the head of the label, died on the flight over to Midem in Cannes. And he died without a will. And so, for all intents and purposes, Bearsville was over. And we were still locked into this contract, along with like NRBQ was on the label at that point too. And it was like, we spent years trying to get out of that deal. And then meanwhile, R.E.M. is like, you should come to IRS. You should come over to IRS. There's a lot of people there that love you and they'll take good care of you. And so when we finally got out of that deal, we did go to IRS. And right as our record came out, R.E.M. went to Warner Brothers.
Yes.
Who could blame him? $40 million? I'd jump ship. But our biggest supporters at the label had left. And so our record came out, and again, we got to tour with R.E.M., but it was like the writing was kind of on the wall at that point. And then Gene Holder left. Gene had moved from bass to lead guitar, and we had a bass player named Jeff Beninado, who was great, wonderful player. And Gene left, and then we went through all sorts of people to play guitar, and eventually, we toured Europe again, and it just it was I don't know. It felt like we were really flogging a dead horse, and so we split up. And
yes, I was going to say it's a bit because you were that time you came around at the time there was Joe Jackson and Elvis Costello and that kind of, I suppose, the Police, but you would have fitted in, and Graham Parker and the Roommates, so you'd have fitted into that kind of audience, I would have thought, with the kind of the sound that you were making.
But we were younger than those guys by a few years, a little bit, I guess, and they were a little more rootsy than we were. I mean, we, like I say, we went out with Dave Edmunds on that tour, and the Blasters came over at the same time and went out with Nick Lowe. And all I could think was, shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't we be opening for Nick Lowe and the Blasters be opening for Dave Edmunds? But anyway,
Yes.
So after that record, after The Sound of Music came out and did what it was going to do, it actually got into the Billboard charts at about 197 for a week and then dropped off. So we did have a moment, a brief moment of slight glory. And then after that, I got a call from R.E.M.'s manager saying, I don't know what you're doing right now, but maybe you want to come out and play keyboards and guitar as the additional pair of hands for R.E.M. So I went out and did the Green Tour for about a year in 1989. And that was great fun. We toured all over the world. We started in Japan and Australia and New Zealand, and then went across the U.S. from L.A. to New York, and then we went to Europe, and then we went back to the U.S. and the East Coast to the West Coast. And so that ate up about 10 months of 1989. And
God, that was quite a glorious time for the band, wasn't it? That Honey, because they'd gone from that sort of slightly obscure cultish band to no, they've sort of stepped into another league, really, haven't they?
Absolutely. And they did it well. They did it the right way. You know, I mean, my feeling about REM has always been that they really knew how to make a success for themselves. And they did that by remembering everybody who helped them all the way up, all the DJs that interviewed them at all the college stations, all the journalists who wrote for fanzines. They would remember these people, and they were lovely to them. And I bet they remember them to this day. Of course, they also remember almost every meal they've ever eaten. So it may just be a character thing for them, but it was great, you know? So I did that. And then, we did some recording. We did the recording for Out of Time up at Bearsville, oddly enough, on the same console that the dB's had used at Ramport, that Albert Grossman had flown over from Ramport and put into Studio A in Bearsville. And so Scott Litt producing the record again on that same board. So that was fun, you know, and what cut that. And I played acoustic guitar on Losing My Religion. So my kids, whenever they go to the hardware store and they hear that song playing, it's like, that's that on acoustic. That's that. So that was fun, you know. And then we had some issues about some songwriting credits. And I left their fold, and it was all right. You know, it took years to kind of get back around to being friends again, but we're all pals again. And then somewhere in there, I'd moved out to Los Angeles, and I started going to a club called Raji's to see this band called the Continental Drifters. And it was absolutely Americana before there was an Americana label. Three wonderful songwriters, Carlo Nuccio on drums, Ray Ganesho on guitar, Gary Eaton on guitar, Mark Walton from the Dream Syndicate on bass, and Dan Magoo on keyboards. And Danny was playing in a bunch of different bands. And eventually I jumped in on keyboards, and I started as their producer and produced a single and produced an album that didn't come out until years later. And then I joined the band, and then various people left the band, and Vicki Peterson from the Bangles joined, and Susan Cowsill, the singer for the Cowsills, joined, and Robert Mache, who played guitar for the Swingin' Madisons and for Sparks, joined, and we ended up moving the whole band to New Orleans, and we were a band like that for many years. And I married Susan, and we had a kid, and it was a big family. You know, it was a great thing. I mean, it was a family in a sense that I had never really been around before. My family were all very, you know, we never raised our voices. Nobody ever got mad. Nobody was ever anything less than pleasant to each other. But these are all people who had been in families where there'd been abuse and there'd been alcoholism. And so when the Drifters would have these meetings, there was our key phrase was, "You don't understand." No, you don't understand. And everybody talking over each other. And I would just kind of sit there and just kind of like, oh, why are they yelling so much? But eventually I started yelling too. So, but we made three really wonderful records and made kind of an impact, I think, with the, you know, it's again, one of those bands where not everybody knew who we were. Most people didn't know who we were, but to the people who knew who we were, we meant a lot.
Yes, absolutely. Because the last month I did an interview with John and also Vicky, because they've got a new they've got a new album out doing Skills work. So so you were all part of that community so you married Susan.
Yes. So John was my brother-in-law briefly. Well, for 10 years.
Right.
And I love Johnny. I hear from him all the time.
God, he's such a cool dude.
He is so funny. And my son, who's now 21, but we went to see, he was playing drums for the Beach Boys.
That's right. He was in that whole world as well.
Oh, yeah. And so he was on the 50th anniversary tour. He and Scott Totten were the two guys from the Beach Boys, the Bruce and Mike version that went on with the Brian band, Darian and Probin and all those guys, and Nelson Bragg. So he was like, he was coming out and sitting with us during the show when the other drummer would get up and play. So it was really a lot of fun. But, you
Well, I
know,
would
like I say,
imagine.
it was a great, great group. And it's still, I love that band a lot. I look forward to the next time we play together. We get together, you know, again, that was a kind of a rough one because I was dealing with a lot of alcohol problems at the time. And I can safely say that while it wasn't the absolute reason that the band broke up, I'm sure I was a very difficult person to work with in the throes of my alcoholism. And
Yes.
Susan and my marriage fell apart, and she ended up remarrying. She married the drummer Russ Broussard, who was the drummer for the band. So there was a kind of a sort of vaguely Fleetwood Mac thing going on there, you know. Happens to the best of us, but
We love the Fleetwood Mac story.
don't we though? But and you know one and then when and we broke up after our third album called Better Day, and it was right after 9/11, and we had a wonderful European tour booked, and part of the band wouldn't go, and I understand their reluctance and didn't feel safe flying and didn't feel safe as Americans outside of the country, so we called it quits. And then I got remarried, and we moved back to North Carolina, and we had a couple of kids, and everybody in the Drifters are big friends again. I'm still good friends with Susan and with Russ. I dearly love Russ Broussard and everybody in the band. I love Vicky and Mark and Robert and all the guys that were in the band, like Gary and Ray. You know, we lost Carlo Nuccio, unfortunately, to cancer a couple of years ago. I have a song on my new solo record, The Face of 68, called Larger Than Life, that is a tribute to Carlo, because he truly was larger than life. He was one of those guys, total New Orleans guy. He was the kind of guy that would drive you around and talk to you in the back seat like this. And he's like,
yes,
just look at the road for a
I know.
second.
I would be
And, you know, but
so what's your next then? So what's your next musical kind of chapter after the Drifters? I mean, do you sort out your alcohol issues?
I did. I'm now 22 years since my last drink, and I have two kids with my wife Sarah that have not had to deal with drunk daddy, which is great. You know, I mean, there were times in the Drifters where Susan and I would have to keep the babysitter over for the extra few hours because we couldn't get up in the morning after show. So I feel very clear-headed now, and I've been able to make a couple of solo records, and I've tried to play as much as I can. I've tried to write as much as I can. I work a job at a performing arts center in the ticket office because I like customer service a lot. So I do that. This last record that I've done that came out this year called The Face of 68, I'm really proud of that. We cut it in 3.5 days in a studio that is about 6 minutes away from my house. Don Dixon produced it. It's 11 songs. You know, we didn't do any real pre-production. I went in with a great rhythm section of Rob Ladd and Robert Sledge. Robert Sledge was the bassist for Ben Folds 5. Rob Ladd has played with everybody from the Pressure Boys here in town to Alanis Morissette and Don Henley. And we went in and we cut it. You know, we cut probably three takes of everything. Dixon and our engineer, Jason Richmond, would be like, okay, sounds good. Let's use take 2. And so we did. And so we were pretty much done by about a day and a half in. And then I cut all the lead vocals and did most of the lead guitar parts and most of the keyboards. And then we spent the last half a day of the 4 days we had booked sitting around shooting the shit, you know, and it was
Yes, that's amazing. So when did you start writing the material for the album?
Well, I'd put out a record in 2018 called Game Day that came out on Omnivore Recordings. And that was basically something that I'd always wanted to do. I cut all the tracks myself at my home studio. And I can safely say that it really doesn't sound great. The songs are great. I stand by the songs, but the recording, meh. You know, I mean, there's something to be said about the interaction of musicians and how things work. In fact, I'm at the point now where I think I would love to recut that record with live musicians someday. So I finished that song, Larger Than Life, And I sat back and I thought, this sounds pretty good. And I started looking at the songs that I'd written since Game Day came out in 2018. And I thought, I actually got some songs here. I've got probably an album's worth. So I ended up with like 14 songs that I sent to Dixon to listen to. And he picked out 12 of them or 11 of them and said, these are the ones that should be the record. And they did tend to sort of less power pop and more sort of harder guitar parts. And I tend to think of this record as kind of reflective of my musical listening pre-Big Star, because I've written a lot of power pop songs, admittedly, and I'm good at that. I like that. And there's a song called She and Me on this record that is pretty much the power pop song, but everything else has got a kind of a grit. And I've been playing lead guitar for a band called the Paranoid Style, who are a wonderful band that are on Bar None Records. And I'd gone in with them as their piano player for a recording, and I was reprising that role last year, and their regular lead guitar player got sick and was not able to make it down from where he was. And so they were like, do we know anybody in Durham that could play lead guitar? And I raised my hand slightly and I said, I'm 6.5 minutes away. Let me go get my guitar and my pedal board. And I did it, and I played guitar. I played the lead guitar all over this record that ended up being called the Instigator. No, sorry, the Interrogator. Sorry. And I'm really, really proud of that. And it gave me a chance to feel like I knew what I was doing. I learned how to make a lead guitar part happen. And I've been so fortunate to play with all these bands with great lead guitar players that I've never really had to be the lead guitar player. So now, in my dotage, I've finally learned how to play lead guitar. And so I thought, perfect time to make a record. So
yes,
that's what I've done.
That is amazing. So then, so I've been listening to it. So what's the kind of some of the ideas behind it? Because you mentioned larger than life, but what about?
I would say that the record is a pretty nice balance of grief and humor. I mean, it's like talking to me, I suppose. I think it's important to keep something silly on there. So I've got a song called My Idea Number 49 that's a kind of a laundry list of all of the things that apparently I invented, which I, of course, didn't. But then there's another song called So Sad About Sam, which is about one of our local guitar heroes in Winston-Salem, a guy named Sam Moss, who was the Mike Bloomfield of Winston-Salem, as far as
right.
He was just such a fantastic guitar player, a big fish in a small pond. He never really wanted to do much more. He owned a guitar store there and all, and he took his own life, and that just left a huge hole in the community. And still, I don't think anybody ever gets over that kind of thing. So
no. There's
that kind of stuff on there. There's not a lot of kissy kissy love songs other than She and Me, but I'm still, at the time I was 68 years old, and I was like, I realized I'm not going to be writing the same type of songs that I did when I was 22. So
no.
Let me come up with these things. So
it's a difficult one, isn't it, really? I've seen a few artists who obviously had written songs in their teen period or early 20s, which were going to be, they were finding it a bit tricky singing it in their 60s because, frankly, one isn't going to be making love all night. One's going to go to the toilet at least twice, not making love.
I don't think there's a point where, I'm sure there's a point where Jeff Lynne said, I will never play an Idle Ray song again, ever in my life, as great as those songs are, And I Roy Wood, I guess, if he ever plays out anymore, will play, Fire Brigade or something like that. I guess he played that with the Beach Boys when they were in London, But
yes, it's tricky.
I get it. I totally get it. I mean, you pass a point where you can't keep talking about cars and girls. You can't keep talking about, oh, she broke my heart. So what? Everybody's hearts get broken once in a while, right?
Yes, this is true, actually.
I
know. Well, but I did, I remember David Bowie's last album, Black Star, was like, okay, that's amazing. And I just listened to the Cure album as well. And it's like Robert Smith's obviously managed to tap into, stuff that is very relevant, but he makes it kind of so poignant. So, one can do it. You don't have to go back, as you mentioned, to Cars and Girls and having your heart broken, because frankly, you're not interested in that anymore. You've moved on, haven't you? As much as you want to listen to young people say, "Oh my God, I've broken my heart," it's like, oh, that's nothing, mate.
I would say so. I think, I don't know how many more songs I have left in me. I mean, I'd like to believe that I've got an abundance of them, and the muse has not departed.
No. So look, the face of 60
taking a break briefly, but
so the face of, going to the album then, the face of 68. How did this song come about? Curious with this.
Well, I can't even remember how that happened, but I think I came up with. I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now, was kind of the key line in that song. And it was kind of looking at my career and thinking, I look at somebody like Steve Wynn from the Dream Syndicate, who is a veritable juggernaut. He is planning years in advance. He's got stuff ready to go with his bands, his solo stuff, the Dream Syndicate reissues. It's remarkable. I am always amazed at his ability to do that. So, and I thought, well, you've been sort of wishy-washy. You've gone back and forth between bands and solo, and going out for 26 years as the keyboard player for Hootie and the Blowfish when they go on tour. And, that's great. But it's also like, it isn't, I mean, I may be the world's most reluctant solo artist. I have never felt like anybody was really clamoring for solo records from me. So I just make them when I feel like it. And I've come to grips with it. And I also have come to grips with the idea that I am not going to go to the toppermost of the poppermost. I am, nobody really is going to give a 69-year-old new artist the time of day. I mean, I'll get played on some radio stations. That's great. I'll get some nice reviews, and that, as we say, and a quarter gets mom a phone call. So, and with streaming being the revenue source that it is, I can't make a living off of that. So I got a job. It's okay.
It's all right, isn't it? Yes,
all
it does.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to enjoy it from here on out.
And you have got some dates actually very soon as well. So you are playing live, aren't you?
I am. I'm going out to the West Coast next week. And I'm going to play one show with a band in Los Angeles, but I'm going to play 29 Palms solo, and San Diego, and Ojai, California, and San Francisco. And then I go up to Seattle and then to Portland. So it's a lot of house concerts, and I try to make a little bit of money on it. I'm sure it's going to cost some money, but I don't even really care. I just want to play these songs for people and have them sit in an audience and not feel like I'm some kind of obstacle to the headliner.
Yes, so. Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't, it's lovely because there's like you mentioned Steve Wynn, but there's Chuck Prophet, and there was Sid Griffin, who was in the and they're sort of turning up at the most interesting and lovely places, giving people a delightful evening, and thinking, actually, this is quite a nice new circuit. I think you find a new circuit when in the 80s there was the sort of the alternative scene. Every sort of city and town in the UK would have a alternative night, and people got on that circuit, and then you might have gone to the next league up and a bit bigger, and possibly the next one, and then you sort of give music up, because most people do after a while, because it often ends in tears and difficulty, and then you rediscover it, and there's a nice new little kind of world that people can just get out there, and people just appreciate hearing those songs. So I think it's fantastic myself.
Thank you. And I really do very much like house concerts. I feel like you get close to people, and they're willing to sit and listen to your new stuff, and they'll listen to your old stuff. And, the thing I've discovered from the dB's tour last year was that people really like the first stuff that they heard most of all. And that's cool. So I'll play a lot of that too.
Yes. And what was it like the last couple of decades then? Did you say you worked and played with Hootie and the Blowfish?
Yeah, I did. I played with them starting after their first record came out, when they moved up to sort of stadium gigs and stuff, and I played with them, and it was great. And then I did the tour in 2018 that was sort of the victory lap for them, although they've gone out again. And I just, I kind of wanted to stop after that and kind of focus on my own stuff. But I really, those guys are great. They're charitable and genuine people, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Yes, and the dB's, are you still sort of enjoying, bringing that band back together?
I think we're pretty much done. We had a nice victory lap last year. But I think that ideally there's not going to be a lot more of that. I mean, I think that there are some, I don't know if we'll ever be able to reissue Sound of Music, but we do own the rights to Like This, and I think that's going to probably come out at some point. So.
Yes, well, absolutely. Are you just last question? Are you keen to sort of have a nice boxed archive of all your material that you can on for the dB's that can be happily accessible?
I hadn't really given it much thought. I'm glad the first 2 records came out. Again, those are the ones that people mostly wanted to hear. So
yes,
that part of the job is done. I think there'll be some people that will be happy to see Like This again. Sound of Music is a great record. It's kind of weirdly recorded with little tiny amps. Again, it's almost like the Little Diesel thing with the tiny amps. But I don't know, again, that's one of those things where we don't know where the tapes are. They may have gone up in the fire at Universal.
Yes.
So I don't know that there's any chance of really making a noticeable difference in that. So, and then there are little bits of things that are out there that could go onto a box, but I don't know. I'm not a collectorly guy as much anymore, even though that song on my record, That Kind of Guy, might suggest that I am. And from our conversation about, mid-70s German prog rock groups, I mean, I like that stuff, but I don't have to have the complete can box, I'll listen to Tego Mego in the car. I love it, So I'll listen to Tons der Lemmings, that's fine, but I don't have to have it. I will always listen to Fearless and Bandstand by Family, because they don't get much better than that.
No, absolutely. Well, look, Peter, thank you ever so much for your time. And I just saw your message. But yes, look, this has been amazing. Look, I really hope the album does well, and I hope your tour, you just have a really lovely time.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope I can get back over to your part of the world as well.
Well, absolutely. It would be amazing to...
just got to find somebody to get the record out over there and book a tour.
Yeah, I know.
If you're listening...
Yes, let's get it sorted.
Let us know.
Definitely. Okay, look, have a lovely day, and thank you ever so much for your time. This has been amazing.
You're so welcome.
I can always send you a link to the interview.
Please do.
I will. Take care.
Great talking with you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that, dear listener, is obviously the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Peter Holsapple for giving me the time for that interview. This has been the C86 Show. David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on all those social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. And all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes and Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.